In this line of work, do looks have an edge over plain looking person?
There's a lot of range and demand for diversity in that realm. As an artist, I think the artist needs to be able to handle humanity, right? Like basically any size, shape, race, everything. It's not like you're going to want to just draw the anatomy book reference for the rest of your life, but partly because they have some interest or passion for art as a process and as a discipline and world, if you will. Generally speaking, artists are awesome people.
So we're in Avid's old darkroom. You had it was a chemical darkroom at one point, and then you've moved to digital. So we've been getting a little bit of a sneak preview here, or a sneak view, insight into his little creative space. And you have a rose, and you've got a glass of wine. Celebrate Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Now, are those nice?
How we do it in the art world, right?
Today's a funny one because it's also the beginning of Lent. So it's Ash Wednesday. So that's why I've got my ashes up here. He really went to town and everybody's foreheads there.
There you go.
So I've been like, so it's a fasting day, and you're like, and I'm like, oh, so it's funny. It's a weird feeling when you fast. So are those mugs in behind you?
Yes. These were by an artist he's like a fantasy artist.
Yeah.
He uses me a lot as his model.
Oh, cool. Nice.
So he's leaned into selling stuff on Fine Art America. So you can do all kinds of things, make yourself a tote bag or coffee mugs or whatever.
Oh, yes. I'm working on doing that for posters, for reproductions of posters, like artwork and posters and stuff like that. So that's cool. So today we were going to talk about, I had some notes down here just talking about like navigating an art model career and, modeling safety, especially for women. And then you've been taking some courses lately about, and so we were touching before about reigniting the creative process as a photographer and as a model as well. Let's start with like the art model kind of advice, like in terms of a career and working your way through that and things to think about, how to structure it.
I think, well, one of the things about art modeling, kind of like different kinds of art work or jobs, is that you can choose to approach it or pursue it professionally, but at almost any level or amount of intensity. So it's one of the things that's kind of nice about it is you can kind of regulate your investment, your involvement. My personal opinion is, it's especially from the modeling side, you're sort of providing a service. So it is a creative art. And in some ways, we're kind of in there with the artists, right? Especially for life modeling, but also even for photography. But what is a little bit different is that we're sort of like providing a specified service, like you need X number of hours for a class, or you want a shoot to do whatever. They can be very collaborative and it can be somewhat of a two-way street, but we are providing that service. And so the reason I mention that is that I personally think it's pretty important to approach it with a sense of professionalism and business-like manner, even if you're doing it pretty part-time, because you're going to be like in that sense, you can almost think of it as I don't know, whatever, like say a landscape person or somebody else that's doing like a specific service, and they may be doing it a little bit or a lot or their whole thing, whatever. Um, but the first priority to me is you don't want to start off on the wrong foot and
Right.
start sort of presenting yourself as unprofessional or unreliable. That's extremely hard to recover from, in any line of business, obviously.
Sure.
But in this case, it's like that's a major part of your value is that you can be counted on. You're going to show up,
Right.
and hopefully on time or close to on time, and be reliable, respectful, businesslike, not petty, not throwing people under the bus, and and kind of descending into some of the chit chat that can go on with some of that.
Right, because like one thing with art modeling is that it's not you don't really run into art models every day, so it's a specialized thing, as you said. And you just think, "Oh, well, I'm willing to do this, so I can kind of behave how I want," or something like that.
Yeah,
But no, professionalism reigns. Even in something as some people might think is we're going to say dressed down, like kind of maybe just not run of the mill kind of work. It is not something that, like I said, you run into every day, that people do. And it's just when I say, oh, even that we have a drawing class here with a model and it's something very exotic to a lot of people to do that just because art isn't, classical life drawing. Not everybody's exposed to it. So,
right.
regarding it highly is important because it is part of a really great tradition. Um, and it's actually rather conservative because you're learning how to do something correctly and there's a whole approach to it, right? So, of course, the modeling
Yeah,
would
and
go hand in hand with that.
it's not like there's a clear course program or whatever to it's not like you can major in art modeling or something, but
Right.
well, maybe you can somewhere, I don't know, but usually it's very much a do-it-yourself kind of thing in terms of figuring out,
Right.
and obviously this would depend a lot on where you are, what kind of area you are, regionally and stuff. So if you're in, like, our area is pretty good in that there are a lot of schools and there's a lot of variety in things that you can kind of get into. It's a dense
Right.
population area, and within 1 or 2 hour radius, we have an awful lot of cities, towns, villages that have different things going on. So you could go out to the Eastern Shore and work with a small group in a town out on the Eastern Shore, or you could be in the middle of DC or Baltimore or whatever. Um, and so there, and likewise with that, you can get a lot of interaction and exposure and sometimes support from other models. You can kind of do some fishing around to get a sense of like what's normal, what's expected in the line of
Mm-hmm.
work. Um, and you can also kind of explore variety. So within the whole world of art modeling, even just within life modeling, there's quite a range. It's one thing to work for a small community college somewhere that has maybe an art program with 2 or 3 instructors or something versus working at the Corcoran in DC or someplace that has a bunch of like a long reputation and things like that. Quick aside to that, like for me as a model, like I don't place like sort of a value judgment on those and in terms of how interesting they are or how good they are to work for. Some of the best schools that I've modeled for don't necessarily have the best arrangement for the models or don't necessarily treat their models better than, say a small community college or a private group
Okay.
or something like that. So anyway, I guess my point with that too is that like part of the answer to that question of getting started and kind of figuring your way out will depend a lot where you are. If you're in a really small city or small town out in the middle of the country or something, it's going to be a different answer to that. There are resources online. There are some, how there are those little sort of like what things to know about, self-education things that people have built.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of the names of them, but there's some websites that have stuff like that that try to be sort of like encyclopedias for all sorts of things. And there are some that I've found that actually have at least a good, no pun intended, a good rough sketch of what it means to be an art model and
Mm-hmm.
how to get started and, you know,
Okay.
what does it mean to be nude or is it always, do you always have to be nude? Like there's a lot of questions like that that a lot of people have starting out.
Sure.
But it's pretty hard and just like so many things, if you're trying to get a really good answer, like an authoritative answer, the internet almost has too much stuff and it's really hard to wade through how much of that is
Yes.
actually good information.
Right. 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 That's true. Did you have somebody teach you the ways or did you figure it out yourself?
A bit of both. I think so I had some background as a photographer and I had met some models more on the photography side through that over the years,
Yeah. Yeah.
and a few of them, whom some of whom I still know, also did life modeling. So that's, and maybe I'll touch on that as a general thing to think about, sort of job and career wise in a second.
Right.
Also, is like the
Yeah.
different flavors and how do you decide. But there are quite a few models that work on those different channels, if you will, like life modeling for traditional arts, and then maybe some modeling for photography, and who knows what else, right?
Right. Right.
So I think that gave me like a little bit of an introduction and gave me a little bit, just chatting with them, getting to them, know them even a little bit when I either hired them or worked with them. Like,
Right.
what's their life like? What do they do? How do they make it work? Um, Learning some of the little subsets like travel modeling. Like, what is that? Is that a separate kind of modeling, or is it just a thing that some models do? Um, and more or less, the answer is both, probably.
So when you say like travel modeling, it's traveling to go to a modeling gig.
Yes, yeah, and it's
Yeah.
it's more common in the world of like photography, modeling for photographers, because the nature of that work tends to be one-off gigs usually.
Hmm.
And like if like the photographer and model hit it off, they may repeat that, but maybe a year later or
Yeah.
whatever. So unlike life modeling, where you can, and this might be a good just general thing, because if anybody listening sort of doesn't know how these different things work, this is a basic that I almost forget because you get used to it. Um,
Yeah.
but the basic difference is like, so life modeling, usually affiliated either with schools or private groups. Repeat gigs with them are pretty common. So a particular art school may want to have a mix of models. They want different body types, male, female. They're trying to work with a range for the students and stuff like that. But they
Right.
also like having models that they know and can count on their kind of roster. So that for the model translates to, especially in an area like this, I can get on the roster or the call list for, maybe a dozen different places in the area. And with that mix, I'm going to be back at those places usually multiple times. At least, some maybe I'll only get asked to come in once in a semester, but then I may be
Yeah.
back the next semester, kind of thing. Others, I might be back multiple times because they only have a couple models on their on their list.
Yeah.
Um, in the world of like photography, that's kind of different because usually you're working for a specific session, either because of an opportunity. It's like, hey, I'm a model. Would you like to work together and see what we can do? Or the photographer has a particular project or concept or something that they want to
Hmm.
try, and they
Hmm.
either recruit a model or wait until one sort of like comes along that matches what they're looking for, in
Hmm.
terms of interest and ability and stuff. But those
Hmm.
tend to be kind of either one-offs or, once in a while, or they're like, hey, if you're in town, look me up, and if we're available, we'll do a shoot. So it's a little more serendipity rather than sort of a regular schedule. Because
Hmm.
of that, I think models who like to work in the world of like art photography will often look at the possibility of traveling around and working with different photographers in different areas. So they're kind of like playing the odds a little bit of a different way, and instead of being like a local area resource and then hoping that schools will call on them and kind of get them onto their
Hmm.
roster and stuff like that, the travel concept allows you to, potentially book. And nowadays, with all the social media and other tools, you can like look ahead and say, well, I think I'm going to be in Arizona in a month. Let me see if I can find some folks that may want to book me, and that kind of thing. It's a
Gotcha.
lot of work, and like, you know, young female models will typically get booked a lot more because
Okay.
a lot more photographers are guys, and it just kind of works
Okay.
out math wise that way. Um, so they can make that kind of work for them, but even so, it's a lot of work. So if anybody is like interested in that, I'm happy to sort of chat about that, or
Yeah.
go into that a little bit deeper. But I wanted to just sort of draw that general distinction, and it's one of the things in the nature of the work that somewhat differentiates what it's like to be a life model,
Right.
especially in some areas. Like if you're say you're in a mid-sized city that's not surrounded by 10 other cities like where we are, um, you might do really well getting on a roster for the one or two places locally that need life models.
Right.
but then you probably don't have like a lot of other options in the area. It's a little bit like flipping that script when it comes to modeling for photography because it can be more of like you're on the go and basically trying to find anybody wherever they are and going to them or to their area, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So when you so life modeling is like it's like a per hour thing. Um and then with the travel, I guess those are details that depends from gig to gig kind of thing, how it gets costed and how much of it is on the model to look after generally. Like, is it that you've just got to get yourself there and then it's like an hourly, or is there like a whole package generally?
Usually, like if you're a pretty successful traveling model for
Yeah.
photographers, you establish your own rate sheet, and you can kind of
Okay.
like look at what's typical, and that's also kind of a good question because in that sense, to be sort of blunt about it, it is a supply and demand question. So, like I'm a middle-aged male. I'm not likely to be able to charge as much typically as a attractive young female, to put it bluntly. Um, so I can set my rates, but then you have to kind of figure out also how negotiable you want to approach your rates, what you charge. Um, and that's sort of this weird trying to balance like how much do you want to do the work? And like even a really successful, like heavily booked, say female traveling model is still going to have some version of this calculus to figure out, which is and is not going to be doing this job solely for the money. Because
Right.
even though they may be pretty successful, may able to make some money, it's not. It just doesn't make sense to do it. Like the novelty of it wears off pretty quickly, and then
Yeah.
pretty soon you realize like you're busting your butt for maybe some pretty good high paying gigs, but all the work in between and the traveling and the expense of all that,
Right.
if you average all that out by per hour and stuff, and then deduct
Yeah.
your expenses for traveling and lodging and whatever else,
Mm-hmm.
you're lucky to be paying bills and doing pretty well. So
Yeah.
not to sound discouraging about it, but it's like
No.
when you hear about, well, geez, I did this 2 hour gig and I made, $600 or something like things like that can happen and that's great.
Yeah.
But then when you sort of average that out or like factor in all of your other costs and everything else,
Right.
it's definitely a labor of love. And because you like the creative aspect of it,
Yeah.
when you're, say, male or middle-aged male kind of thing, that's sort of even more so. So I'm constantly kind of like debating, well, because in the realm of photography, there's this trade term TF, which is trade for, and that's a
Um,
buzzword basically saying that let's do this session and no one's going to pay anyone cash money kind of thing, but the actual payment is that I'm going to provide you something for your modeling services. So the
okay.
photographer pays you, like if you're starting out, you need work for your portfolio and you want to be
Right.
able to like have some, good, like here's some good solid work that I can show with
Yeah.
this known photographer or something,
Yeah.
or just experimental, like, hey, let me see if I can do some cool stuff and show that in my portfolio.
Yeah.
That's what you're getting in terms of pay.
Gotcha.
But, that doesn't pay for hotel bills, gas, you know, all
Mm-hmm.
that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you can choose to do that, but um, then it gets really kind of complicated because you have to start thinking about things like setting a precedent for your own self, your own work.
Yep.
Like it's one thing to do that on a one-off basis, but if you frequently take TF assignments, it may start to get known that it's like, yeah, hey, you'll work for basically for free or basically for just the pictures.
Right.
Um, and is that something you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
Like in a lot of business, there's the question of like, you know, it can be attractive to try to lowball your pricing to get people interested in buying your stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or in this case, buying your services, so to speak. Uh, but then do you create that as the expectation? And how do you dig yourself out of that if you do? Right.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so
Um,
it varies a lot. I'm almost surprised, personally, at the gigs that I've managed to get that are either decent paying or at least pay enough to help cover the expenses because I
Mm-hmm.
am a sucker for a creative project. And if somebody like has really good work and they offer me a gig and it's kind of like a one shot deal that I'd be able to do that because I'm traveling to the area or whatever, it's really hard for me to say no just because
Sure.
they're not offering to pay, an hourly rate or whatever.
Right. So I think it's interesting you mentioned a rate sheet. So I can see you have like, life kind of modeling rate sheet, and then you've got your travel rate sheet. Are there any other kind of categories that, I think those are primarily the two types
Those are the
you
two
know,
broad categories.
yeah,
Well, the people have different ways of trying to approach this. What I do is I have one rate sheet that kind of covers everything, but
yeah,
then I'm still free to negotiate whatever on a case by case
gotcha,
basis. So
gotcha.
even what I'll do sometimes is like, so if I'm booking a trip, like as an example, I have a trip mostly to visit relatives to New England coming up in about a month, and it's not really enough lead time to really plan my trip around gigs. But because I'm already doing a lot of driving and I knew there were some photographers in that region,
Hmm.
I'm like, well, I might as well try. And so I've spent a little bit of time trying to match up and see if I could do a gig or
Yeah.
two while I'm doing that. Um, and so in that case, I might first reach out to the prospective artist or photographer and say, would you like to work together? Because the
Hmm.
constraint is more like I have this frame of time, are
Hmm.
you free in any of these 2 or 3 days and interested in working with me kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
So that's the first part of the sort of
Yeah.
dating thing, just to go
Yeah.
Valentine's theme, right? And then, and it's almost like, and so I might have the luxury because it's not my only source of income, like it is a source of income, but not my only one.
Yeah.
I could sort of have the luxury of saying, well, it's okay if I don't book any gigs. And if I
Right.
get a gig that either is TF or not
Yeah.
paying me directly,
Yeah.
I can consider that
Yeah.
in this case.
Yeah.
Other cases, because then a couple months later, I'm doing a whole trip out west that
Yeah.
is gig oriented. And although I'd survive coming away breaking even or even a little less, like it would not be good
Right.
because I'm doing it largely like where gig work is my priority for this trip. So I have to lean more heavily into like really recruiting, paying gigs.
Yeah.
And then it gets complicated. This is the kind of thing where you end up spending an awful lot of time in the planning and logistics because then I'm like, I might have 10 lead questions out there to different, say, photographers or artists or whatever. And then I'm trying to juggle all that and figure out like, okay, well, this person says yes, they'd like to work with me, but only on a TF basis. This one
Okay.
is willing to pay, but they're way out of the area, and it's like half a
Yep.
day's driving just to go make $100. It's all this kind of
Yeah.
crazy juggling and figuring out. Um, Especially if you're like a male and you don't have a reputation as you know a model in that area or something. So it's kind of a lot. It's kind of fun. It's a bit of an adventure. Like I'm doing it partly because I'm looking forward to the trip and seeing what I can
Right.
do.
Yeah.
But as a job perspective, it's like you could easily spend more time just trying to manage your bookings and all the
Sounds
prospects
like
and
it.
stuff
You
like
need,
that, and the
yeah,
scheduling.
you need an agency to look after that for you.
Just about
um,
do, yeah.
yeah. Um, so you say that you're getting gigs and jobs here and there, and what do you attribute your success to? It's like, to me, I would think it's your level of professionalism and your knowledge. Um, and I think you've just got this huge amount of experience behind you. And you're kind of like, yeah, okay, you want to do this? How about this? You can bring a lot to the table.
Yeah, it's kind of well, I view this in a sort of I try to view it in a pretty positive way, but one of the sort of fun things about the job is trying to figure out each prospective artist that I may work with or for.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a different version of this same kind of dance in the life modeling traditional arts world and in the photography world. Um, so I have kind of like my arsenal of skills and things that I can do, but photographers and artists are all different in what they're looking for. So they're different in their personalities and their approach, obviously, kind of like their style
Hmm.
of working with figure models of whatever type. But then also what specifically they're looking for right now or for this project. And you can get a little bit of a sense of the first one. So let me back up a little bit. So say within the world of the traditional arts life modeling, the version of that same question is kind of like the style or vibe that each school or group or instructor has.
Okay.
And it's a sort of a fun challenge to me as an introverted, weird, creative kind of person, um, to like try to crack that code a little bit to try to figure out like, how do I read this person and try to figure out where they're coming from and what they need? Um,
Okay.
they like likewise even an instructor, it could be the University of Maryland, art school, or it could be an individual small group or whatever, a little gallery or something that's like somebody like yourself that's sponsoring programs, or even sometimes independent artists that hold little like, workshops in their basement or whatever.
Right.
You're trying to figure out like, well, what do they need, what are they looking for, both personally, like their personal approach to the instruction and moderating or hosting sessions, but also the particular program that you're talking about. Like you'd be coming into week 4 of a 6-week workshop versus, and is it drawing, painting, is it short pose, long pose, all those. I won't go off into that, but basically kind of like figuring out what they're after
Hmm.
specifically. Um, but then also kind of like the way they like to work, kind of like their style. Um, do they look at the model as come in, do the job. We just need you. We expect you to be professional. That's why we have you on the list. You know what to do.
Hmm.
Come in, hit it, do the job. Okay, thank you very much. See you later. Or is it much more of like a more personal thing and kind of like often there'll be like a lot more chit chat and a lot more they want to get to know the model a little bit and like you actually establish some rapport and that becomes part of your like sort of working relationship. It's similar to any other sort of working relationship or workplace in that sense. You might
Hmm.
have coworkers that you come in, you do your job together, and that's it, and that's okay. And then others that you kind of get to be work friends with, right? You actually get to know them a bit. um, you might know what's going on in their life personally a bit, stuff like that. um,
I'm
that's
just gonna,
all going on in that world too.
yeah, I guess like when the first time I met you, when you came into the gallery for the class, I was glad that, Doni, our teaching instructor, teaching artist, he knew you. So I thought, okay, good. Avid knows he's in a place with Doni that this is all good. And I didn't know, um, I'd never really talked to a model before. I've only ever just seen them, they're quiet in the room and they kind of come in, my past experience, and then leave. And I was delighted that, you're talkative, you know? So I was like, oh, this is a nice opportunity because now I'm on the side of kind of running the class. And also it's much smaller than one of those art league kind of classes that I was in before. So, um, I guess are models typically talkative with like the students, or do they prefer, you know, hey,
Good
I'm in and I'm
question.
out?
I would say like most that I know. Well, and the funny thing with models is like we sort of all know each other and we sort of don't because
Yeah.
we're almost never in the same place at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
we work in the same places, but not at the same time, usually.
Yeah.
So we're like ships passing in the night, whatever. But
Right.
especially during the pandemic, a lot of us were working together actually online to figure out online modeling and different things like that, which
Yeah.
was kind of a treat because we got to know each other a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's obviously a generalization, but I would say most of us tend to be pretty introverted and pretty quiet people.
Okay.
Um, it's a little bit of an irony of the of the line of work, right? Because we're putting ourselves out there, like literally putting ourselves on display. And it's always I'm not going to pretend like I have that figured out, but I've always kind of been interested in that kind of dichotomy of like we're we're literally exposing ourselves and even whether it's clothed or not, like our whole job is to be there for people to view and work
Behold,
with
yes.
visually and all that. Um, but we're often as a group probably pretty quiet and pretty introverted. Um, and I think so. To answer your specific question, like usually we don't typically talk or interact that much either during a session or necessarily before and after it. And part
Yeah.
of that, like for me personally, and so I don't totally want to speak for like all models, so to speak, right? But
Sure.
my, I think my observation extends to a lot of other people just from what I've seen and gotten to know them. But
Yeah.
part of that is also just kind of getting into the work mode, right? Like if we're busy, if we're lucky enough to be fairly busy, um, we're kind of going from thing to thing. Maybe not
Hmm.
five things in one day or whatever, but we've got our schedule. Um, we're trying to do a good job and make sure we're there. It's kind of tiring sometimes too.
Yeah.
So we're not always in a mood to be super chatty. Um,
Yeah.
we may be kind of like, okay, I'm ready to go now. um,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
often because that's the expectation, right? Like if you're in a busy university class, a lot of times you're modeling like right up to the end of the class time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, the students will all have to get their stuff together and get the heck out to
That's
get to their
right.
next thing, or they
That's
want
right.
to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it sort of just becomes like the established pattern or norm that, we're
Yeah.
not going to sort of sit around and, shoot the breeze or whatever for half an hour kind of thing.
Right. And
It
maybe
is a
not
nice treat in a way.
everybody's, yeah. And maybe not everybody, every model is interested to see what the students are doing, within their own drawings or something like that. But you seem to take an interest, that I don't know if it's typical or atypical, but it's nice. It definitely enriches the experience. And when we did the drawing class at the Harrison, a lot of people wanted to talk to you, and people, I don't know what they asked you and stuff like that, but it's really neat. Like I appreciate your approachability, despite being an introvert, and I think that's really cool.
Oh, well, thank you. And I think like, especially the pretty established kind of experience models that I know, are kind of similar. Like most of them have some, like if they've stayed with it for more than a few months or a couple of years or whatever,
Yeah.
it's again not all about the money and benefits, so to speak, but
Right.
partly because they have some interest or passion for art as a process and as a discipline and a
Gotcha.
world, if you will. I mean,
Right.
generally speaking, artists are awesome people,
Yeah.
and it's nice to be like they're, like
Well,
it's
you're an
a
artist
good
along
group
with
to be
them.
around
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so some of it is, so then to me it's like, well, and so I would say to a new model or somebody who's relatively new and maybe they've done some sessions and they've kind of got the basic logistics and made it work, but they're down into a little of the nuances, like some of trying to figure out some of the etiquette and the different like things like reading the
Yeah.
different vibes of different settings.
Right.
Um, some may not know if that's kind of okay, right? Like kind of
Right.
etiquette wise, it's like, is it all right to, like, I finished my job, should I just disappear,
Yeah.
or is it okay to kind of like hang out and
Right.
you know
So
socialize a little
basically,
bit or
like,
take an interest in?
people running the class can kind of share, what can happen, and then put the model in a position that okay, I understand the vibe and, how I
Yeah, I
can
mean, I
conduct
think it's
myself.
good. Like you have to read the room specifically, even if you've modeled five times for the same instructor, you have to read the
Mm,
room for that day too, right? So, I mean,
gotcha.
that's just sort of a common sense thing, but like figure out like, okay, well, we're a little bit over schedule and there's another class coming in and whatever. So like, this isn't going to be one of those times when we can kind of hang out and chat. Um,
Yep.
or it might be, right? So kind of like figuring that out, figuring out if there's interest, if
Yeah.
it's also like they're brand new, freshman art students and they're already kind of like nervous and figuring this stuff out, figuring out how to carry all their art supplies to the next, like all that, right? All those little things that you can just kind of like read the room and kind of get a sense of that.
Yeah.
But in general, I kind of encourage models to like try to lean into just ask some questions. Like I think the students and the artists appreciate that, right?
Yeah.
They're trying to
Yeah.
figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
Um, and then another little nuancy thing, right, is like, well, how do you either ask about or comment on their work?
Right.
And you know, again, a lot of us are very kind of introverted, like we're maybe not like socialites or whatever. So figuring out all the cues and like how to kind of interact in a way that's like you're showing interest uh,
Right.
and maybe commending their effort, but not
Right.
judging their work
Right.
because you might look at it, you might even be thinking like, that doesn't even remotely look like me. Like, but who, first of all, who are you to judge? You don't
Right.
know what they're working from or with. You may or may not know how advanced they're supposed to be, but don't try to do the art teacher's job, so to speak.
Gotcha.
But you
Yeah.
can kind of like commend their effort. And I've like my personal approach is like I'll try to notice something interesting about it, especially in a like class that has like longer poses or like it's a fairly
Yeah.
intensive class.
Yeah.
Um, what's kind of different or interesting about a particular student's thing? And I wouldn't be surprised if they appreciate a little pat on the back or like somebody just noticing like, wow, you chose like really bold colors. Or
Right.
you know, it's kind of cool the way you captured the whole background and details of the stool that I was sitting on, or like where other
Right.
people just have you floating in space. Like little,
Right.
without being like critical about it,
Yeah.
or even from the standpoint of telling a person, "Wow, your work is amazing. Like you're going to be
Right.
the next whatever." You know,
Right. Right.
kind of draw the line at that a little
I
bit,
look
but you
great.
can that doesn't shouldn't
Yeah.
stop you from noticing
Yeah.
something kind of interesting or even their effort. Like, hey, you might have seen out of the corner of your eye that that student from their body language they were really struggling, right? Like, and you could make a just a careful, sort of neutral, personal comment that it's like looked like you were really fighting for that, like you were
Yeah.
wrestling with something, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes and they're like,
Yeah.
you see them measure you 12 times because they just can't get the proportion right, or something.
Right. Yeah. I know that I was very shy because I just thought, oh, I don't want to offend the model, because I can't draw, and kind of just going in and saying, well, you're not offending me if because you're just at this point in time and you just need to practice to get where you want to be. So if you're feeling shy about it, don't worry about it. You just have to practice or something like that. But that to me was having the teacher so closely involved with my work and then having you look at it and talk about it. It was very freeing for me as I'm learning. So it was great. Yeah. Yeah.
That's neat.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this line of work, do looks have an edge over a plain looking person, let's say? Like, you know,
I
superior,
think
or is
so.
it?
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, it depends. That's a fair question, and it's like it can be delicate or a little awkward to go there, but I think it might as well, right? Because
Yeah.
it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Um, again, slightly different answers for the world of like life modeling and
Yeah.
say photography. So first in the world of life modeling, there's a lot of range and demand for diversity in that realm. I know that some instruct, and there again, it can even depend on the particular like unit or exercise or class that you're working
Sure.
for. Because if it's more focused on anatomy, like somebody who has some definition and stuff may have an advantage, so to speak. I hate to call it
Gotcha.
an advantage, but like that may be more preferable for a particular class.
Sure.
Um, because you can actually see it's almost like you're a textbook, walking textbook figure to be able to look
Yeah.
at, say, musculature. Um,
Right.
but that doesn't mean you can't be a little heavier or different kind of body type and still do that job.
Right.
Um, so that can be a preference or even a kind of a requirement for some life modeling in general. Like if it's a more, it's all about figure painting, let's say, and maybe in a more advanced level to where they've kind of already addressed the basics of anatomy and
Hmm.
name the parts and all that kind of thing. Um, then probably there's even more demand and need for diversity because as an artist, I think like the artist needs to be able to handle humanity, right? Like basically any size, shape, race,
Right.
everything. Like it's not like you're going to want to just draw the anatomy book reference for the rest of your life,
Right.
kind of thing, right?
Right.
So in that world, I think there's a pretty good demand for it, and generally a good respect for that. And I think like a lot of things in society too, a somewhat widening tolerance and respect and interest for different body types and things like that too, which I think is great. Um, like in the world of a lot of modeling, so good segue maybe, because like with photography, it's a little bit different. Traditionally, there's probably been a lot more like idealized view of like we want a really great looking model. So I don't quite fit that mold as a male model because I'm a little bit older. Um, I'm defined, but I'm not hunky. I'm not like super muscular. I'm not a weightlifter, or bodybuilder kind of person. Um, and so that was something that I wrestled with some years back too, of like, who am I to be doing that? Because like if you look through, say, a lot of figure photographers, fine art, nude photographers, stuff like that. Um, even so, first of all, like probably 80-90% of that is oriented towards female models. So even amongst that small percent that is interested in male models, they tend to be younger and kind of like calendar type hunky guys, right? Like usually, half again as big as me muscularly kind of thing. Um, the one reason I chose part of my model name, Avid Light, it's a little bit of a play on words, but I have a light build and I pretty much always will. It's not necessarily a bad thing as far as health and stuff like that, but it's like even if I wanted to get big, as guys will
Hmm.
say, muscularly big, I'm not even sure
Yeah.
if I could. I just like I would have to be on, whatever extra steroids and blah blah blah. So I kind of just had to at some point I had to be okay with that and just decide, well, do I want to even be that? Or if I did, am I willing to do all the work to be at the gym every freaking day and like whatever, chugging protein shakes all day, whatever. I don't even know what all those guys
Yeah.
necessarily do, but find a
Right.
routine to get big. I'm like,
Isn't
I
what
don't
did
think so.
Rocky do? Didn't he do like eggs, like just raw eggs or whatever?
Raw
10,
eggs.
10 raw eggs in the morning.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
And like in a way, a quick aside, but like these days again, world of the internet or age of the internet is like I kind of feel for any guys that are trying to do that because there is so much information out there and probably 98% of it's crap information as far as like
Mm,
how to get big and like you need testosterone boosters, you need this, you need to, and it's like you could probably end up making yourself sick or really unhealthy if you just followed all this
right.
random stuff. Um, but and
And
so
then,
anyway, so like, well, and so yeah, I was just gonna say, so like that was part of my thing to overcome personally is to kind of say, well, Um, I don't I don't have to like I'm not just trying to sell myself as some calendar, you know, 25-year-old hunky bodybuilder guy, right? Um, so is there any niche in that market for
yeah,
my work? And part of it, and some would say no. I've had female models tell me who are very experienced and have like a lot of traveling experience and stuff like that, working the
yeah,
photography side, who have kind of flat out said like, Um, I have never met any successful male, like fine art figure models. Like, so, they were sort of saying
yeah.
it almost as a warning, like, don't
Uh,
expect much, kind of thing. Um, so I sort of get that. And I'm kind of like, well, that is kind of the reality. There's not a hell of a lot of demand for that. And so for things like planning a trip, it translates to, well, even if I go to a populated area, I'm looking kind of for the needle in the haystack within the needle within the small haystack,
right.
kind of
Gotcha.
deal. So I live with that, and I'm like kind of okay with that. But I feel like I can still bring things to it, and I've been very had the pleasure to work with a number of photographers who were like open minded enough. Um, some often in the gay male community are actually looking for male models, but even apart from that, like they just like guys that were like, "Hey, I need to widen my portfolio," and they've even made it a point to say, "At some point, I need to work with a male nude model or something," and
Gotcha.
um, then I can actually I enjoy that because then it's partly on me to say, "Well, all right, let me actually bring some creativity
Yeah,
and make this a good creative
yeah,
session."
right.
And usually the results have been pretty good. So
Yeah, as I said, you bring something more. You bring like fellow artistic inspiration to the scene. because you yourself are an artist as well, like not just art model, but, a photographer and plus all your experience. So, and then I was going to say that ask about, what you know about for the women. And this is going to segue also into just safety, of modeling, art modeling world. For the women, do you find that there's like, is it similar to, fashion modeling with what they look for in models, or is it, you know, I don't know, basically does it mirror fashion modeling in terms of what people are looking for in female models?
I would say so. I think there's a there's a good demand for general diversity in terms of like race, hair color,
Mm-hmm.
look, like the specific look, the facial features, that kind of a thing. And when you think about it, it makes sense too, because even if photographers are kind of gravitating towards an idealized version of the
Yeah.
model look, they don't want the same exact, look
Right.
all the time.
Right.
So there's a demand for some, kind of variation and kind of like also what the model can bring to um,
Right.
the shoot in terms of their expression and their
Right.
body expression, their posing, things
Right.
like that, and their creativity. Um, I think that world is opening up a bit too, thankfully, like becoming a little bit more open-minded in terms of like looking for diverse body types
Right.
and facial looks and all kinds of things. Um, but part of it I think is a little bit of a reckoning of like, okay, like constantly looking for this sort of idealized, for lack of a better term, sort of playboy oriented, kind of a model or something. It gets a little boring after a while, and it's not very
Sure.
realistic. Um, there's,
Well, I think,
and
yeah.
there are even like sort of I don't know what you call it, subgenres or whatever, but there are people who tend to actually like heavier or thinner or this or that, younger,
Right.
older, things like that.
Right. Um,
So some of it is
well,
the demand, if you will, and then some of it is the acceptance.
I just thought of who was that? Martha Stewart. She wasn't she just in was it Swimsuit Illustrated or something? And I think she's about 75 or 76. So some people like want to break the ceilings and stuff like that, and do different things, and
Yeah.
challenge kind of what the ideals are.
It depends a little bit on the subgenre, say within photography. Like if you're truly about making some sort of an artistic statement, whether it's just a visual aesthetic that you're going for or
Yeah.
like a sort of storytelling thing, you actually want to convey like a concept or a story.
Yeah.
Um, well then obviously like that should really include almost any kinds of humans, right? Like you're trying to tell something about the human condition and stuff like that. It's nice if they have a beautiful body, right? But to kind of put it in a crass way, but by the same token, like how far are you going to dig your heels in as a photographer or something to say like, no, I need all my models to have a certain kind of a look. Like, okay, really? Because that's
Right.
not people.
And and I was going to ask about kind of personality, because I think photography allows for, because you're capturing a moment that, that moment can be a burst of personality, or, subtle personality or something, but you're, getting a person is, you know, part of it can be capturing that person's personality, the subject's personality. In the life drawing class, it's more musculature, it's more kind of defined,
The
body,
physical
all the,
presence.
yeah, the physical presence, because you're not acting, so to speak. You are holding a pose. Although in there, you can bring out your personality in terms of, the pose that you hold. Like there's not like, these are the 10 poses that, you must master, as you bring that interpretation in. And a lot of the times I would think,
Yeah, that's part of that kind of going back to that reading the room and the instructor thing a little bit too, because say in the life modeling side, it depends a lot on the nature of the particular like class
yeah,
and both the course or the kind of group or session. but
Yeah.
also even that particular session again, because where are they in their syllabus and that kind of thing. If
Right.
they're if they're very early on and they're really just trying to figure out anatomy and proportion and stuff, it's like there's not really any room for or need for trying to express
Right.
yourself personality wise. Um,
Right.
and you kind of like I probably mentioned this, I think, in our previous session too. One of the things I like about modeling in general is the variation and the diversity of the nature of the work, because I can get bored doing the same thing over and over again too. If I
Sure.
only did, the early in the semester life modeling or drawing 101 classes, uh, I might get a little bit tired of that, but it's actually nice
Sure.
to have that in the mix,
Yep.
because on the one hand, often they are at a point where it's like you're not going to go bring some sort of a character like represent, like there's not really any room for that. They just need to figure out your body, basically, right?
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Because they're so early, they've got so much going on in their head trying to figure it out and trying
Right.
to get the skills down and the
Right.
drawing. Um,
Sure.
but then other times, sort of the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, is when you work with a group, um, either in person or online or anything like that. Like one I did last night is more of this nature of kind of letting you, they expect the model to figure something out and bring it. Like,
Mm.
give me something different, come up with something. And it could almost like actually that would be a little bit exhausting if every session I did was like that, right? Where
Right.
it's like, now I got to think up another new thing. Like I got
Right.
like if all of that was on me every time, that would
Yeah.
get a little bit tiring. Um,
Sure.
but it's a nice mix because you're kind of like bouncing around on that spectrum between it's
Yeah.
all on the model or it's all on the instructor and students
Yeah.
to like figure out what you're doing and what to bring. The photography realm is kind of in some ways a little bit similar, but it tends to be more like, there's so many basic photographs of the human body. There's plenty of that, right?
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
in pretty much every session and every engagement between model and photographer, there's going to be some like, what are we doing? Like, what's the goal? But there's a different version of that same question of kind of like, did the photographer book you because they actually have an ongoing project and they want you to do a particular thing? Even
Right.
within that, they may then say, so my concept is blah, 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 blah. Do you think you can do something with that? And then
Yeah.
that's kind of fun. It's kind of where we get to have fun as a model to kind of say, oh, cool. So I'm kind of playing a little bit of a part, but I have some latitude to figure out, how to make it my own a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, both, and it could be whether it's if there's costuming or accessories or with your posing and with kind of the mood that you bring to it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
do you want to show up all perky and this is going to be like a high energy, like boom, that's an athletic thing or something, or is this like we're kind of setting a mood? This is going to be like some somber, maybe
Mm-hmm.
or maybe even like a depressing social statement piece or like whatever they're trying to do, right?
Right.
Um, and then also within that, the nature of the balance between photographer and model in terms of who's deciding, who's driving that,
Right.
who's at the wheel. Sometimes it's kind of 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll tell you, hey, this is my general idea, but pretty much whatever you want to do is cool. Or are they going to be more directive and kind of say, all right, this is what we're going to do. And then once you get there, it's kind of like you're pretty much just following instructions. Um, and there again, even in the just photography realm, if I was only working there, I kind of like enjoy that range of ways to
Mm-hmm.
work. I
Mm-hmm.
used to look at it with intimidation. I used to look at it earlier in my modeling career, if you want to call it that time frame. It was kind of terrifying because it's like I didn't know how that was all supposed to work. I didn't know if there were kind of like standards in terms of like what's expected of you as the model. And so there was a bit of intimidation kind of going into stuff. Am I doing this right? There's not exactly a clear playbook.
Right.
And then over time, I gradually figured out like one, there is no one answer to that question. And two, it's kind of a skill in itself to try to figure it out case by case, both, person by
Right.
person and then session by session. And as I mentioned, it's kind of like for me as a growth thing, it's kind of cool because I don't have great, like out in the open, out in the wild people skills. I'm more comfortable with like somebody that I know in a situation like this. I can obviously talk forever, but but I'm not the kind of person you're going to find at a bar just like you know picking conversations with the person next to me kind of stuff.
See, I
Um,
find that hard to believe because you are so talkative and easy to talk to. So, well, there you go. I'll count myself one of the lucky people who gets that. So,
uh,
um,
oh, model
that's
safety though too. We're going to hit on that.
yeah. I want to talk about model safety exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that might be a good segue for that. So it varies a lot, and like if I were to try to write down sort of like fatherly advice for anybody starting out, or just in
Yeah.
general, right? Like, I mean, I've been trying to work with like I got to know a model who's older than me who just started recently too, and he's
Oh,
doing
cool.
great. But it's kind of cool to see those because like he's kind of a kid in the whole business, so to speak. Um,
Mm,
but even that's important to know because he's somebody who has a lot of life experience, so he knows general things about like, what to watch out for and what questions
yeah.
to ask when you go into a new job, right? Where if you're 19 years old or something, you may not even know what questions to ask about some things like what's okay to have, who should I ask, when do I ask,
Right.
um, should I ask this school instructor or photographer, what to
Mm-hmm.
do and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. They're trying to figure all that out. So the reason that kind of ties in a little bit to some of the safety issues. Um, I'm thinking out loud a little bit, but I'd almost break it into a couple different areas. One would be in kind of protecting yourself in the business aspects. So avoiding scams, avoiding getting ripped off, avoiding somebody trying to book you for free after they've kind of lured you into the project
Mm-hmm.
and you thought it was going to be paying gig. I've still had some weird dialogues where partway into the back and forth planning a session, it came out that the person wasn't actually planning to pay me. I even had one not too long ago where we had talked about a price or a rate, and only when we were almost ready to like set the time did I find out that that person was talking about what they expected me to pay them for the
Oh.
privilege of modeling for them. I'm like, wait, what?
Oh.
And so I was almost like suckered into that, right? And it's like I should know
You're
better,
paying
but
them.
it just kind of was a good little reminder of like, yeah, stuff like that can still happen. And luckily, at least I didn't actually do the session, and we found it out beforehand. It would have been really awkward if I got there and they're like, "Okay, so it's $300." I'm like, "No, but the other direction." Like, you
Right.
know,
Right.
right?
Wow.
So business sense too, and that's a light duty safety thing, but it is kind of important too. You don't want to get ripped off.
Right.
You don't want to be vulnerable to scams, and there are a lot of scams.
Mm.
A quick aside for that, without like you could probably do a whole session just on uh, business scams and
Scams.
stuff in the art and model world. But what I've noticed, just a good thing to realize, is that there are scammers, and I think networks of scammers probably who've recognized the vulnerability among creatives. There are a couple vulnerabilities. One, they're not necessarily usually business like people first and foremost. They're artists. That's their main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And their business savvy and sense is secondary.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just like maybe I can find somebody naive to prey upon, right? Um,
Right.
and what I just mentioned was maybe almost an example of that, right? But then also, there's a certain what do I call it, vanity amongst both artists, visual artists, and
Mm.
models,
Mm-hmm.
and a desire to be both accepted and then also to just get gigs. It's gig work too. So by its nature, we're trying to pursue that golden ring or whatever you want to call it. Like so. There's a definite tendency for us to say yes first if there's something that looks like an opportunity. Because we're all struggling to try to get gigs and try to get our work
Sure.
recognized. If you're an artist, right, you're on that side of like trying to get your stuff out there.
Yeah.
So kind of like the whole what was the digital the NFT craze of
Oh, yeah.
basically targeting artists to get into this whole like, hey, sell your work and blah blah.
Yeah.
So I've seen it from a couple of different angles, both um, from a writer's perspective, but also like there's so there are a lot of vultures kind of circling all of us creatives, looking for those, looking a little bit for that kind of sense of vanity to kind of say, "Hey, you're waiting to be discovered, aren't you? Or you would love to work
Mm.
with a great thing." This definitely, I've actually been hit upon, so to speak, by people trying to lure me to great fashion modeling gigs in New York City, Manhattan, and then they name drop, a bunch of like, oh, whatever, Louis Vuitton, like what I don't even know the fashion world at all, but right,
You got that one right.
they'll name drop some really great fashion photographers, and there are some that are flat out like pretending to be those people. So they're pretending to be some well-known fashion photographer and say, "Hey, you've got a good look, and we'd love to have you to this event in New York." And then there's some whole big elaborate con job and scheme attached to that. So, like, you have to like without going into all the specifics, because that again, that could be another hour, right? But um, I think the recurring theme there is to realize that they realize your vulnerability, that button that they can push of kind of
Right.
like wanting to make a break or wanting to get accepted, wanting to hit something, right? And they're going to use that because that's the chink in your armor, so to speak. So that's one thing, like just in general is like you've got to be you do want to be out there. You want to be pursuing possibilities wherever you can. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying don't, but you have to be
Right.
hyper vigilant and almost like it's the cliche thing. If it sounds too good to be true,
It
and
probably is.
it still applies though very much here, right? If it sounds
Yep.
too good to be true, stop and ask yourself really critical questions. Like if say you get a gig offer, um, and it's like, oh my gosh, this would be amazing. It's like they're paying like $1,000 for me to just show up for this day and do some,
Yeah.
put on an outfit and do this thing. It's like, okay, wait a minute. How did they say they found me? And,
Right.
like start to ask yourself some critical questions about that. It's like, did they actually say anything specific about your look or what they want you for? Or did they just use literally like copy paste things to make you feel good about yourself, right?
Right.
Use that as a way to kind of get at you, or
Yep.
or how awesome this opportunity would be to get your interest
Yep.
that way because it's like, oh
Right.
wow, I could get this amazing break, right?
Exclusive invitation or something like that. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so you could even choose to, and because if it's iffy, like you're not so sure, you could still choose to engage, respond to the email or whatever the case might be, but be super duper careful and expecting, like think about what questions might help kind of bubble out any ill intent, if you will.
Right.
Um, there used to be a scam that for on photographers years back, and it was amazing that it would kind of work, but in a way it was doing that same thing. People would try to book you to photograph a wedding, and they were actually
Oh.
going to pay you in advance for the wedding. And they'd give you all these specifics to make it seem legit. And I mention this because there are very similar things targeting models. Um, they make it seem legit by giving you very, very specific information, like it's going to be at this address, it's at the Radisson Hotel ballroom at the blah, 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 right? So it sounds kind of like, okay,
Yep.
this is like an actual thing.
Yeah.
Um, but they've just faked that out, right? Like they just picked a random place on Google Maps or whatever and pretended like we're going to have a fashion show there or something. So think about that possibility. Don't assume, even if it looks kind of well crafted.
Yeah.
Ask a couple things. Ask some stuff, without you don't have to be a jerk about it, right? Because what if it is legit? But
Yeah.
try to ask a little more to tease that out. Like,
Yeah.
okay, so can you let me know how you found me or why you're interested in and I mean, what kind of product line would I be modeling or what's it for or blah blah blah.
I think I just somebody was trying to scam me lately, not artists, but just something else. And I think the scary thing was how much information they can get on you, so that you feel like, oh, well, this person, nobody really takes that much interest in me. So this must actually be coming from somebody who really does know what I do and, all that kind of stuff. So don't be fooled by a shockingly, large amount of information that they have on you. But yeah.